So the First World War has come to an end. Now you must think that all destruction would now come to an end and peace and equality would prevail, right? Well, in an ideal world perhaps, but the peace that was established after the First World War was far from equal. Now you must feel that isn't peace a positive concept? Well, in comparison to war, peace definitely is a positive concept. But sometimes peace involves
Too much concentration of power in one hand.
and too much compromise on the other. So thus sometimes a peace or a peace settlement could be a negotiation. Is exactly what we see in the case of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty which ended a world war but soon would cause another. But before that, what is a treaty? So a treaty happens to be an agreement or a settlement between two sides after the end of a war. So when the war is coming to an end or a war has to be brought to an end, the two sides who are involved in the conflict have to agree on a couple of terms. So therefore this agreement opens up the ground for negotiations. Negotiations which include or involve the two sides sitting down and having proper debates and discussion. And finally, this particular negotiation helps to settle all the remaining disputes peacefully, as the treaty is supposed to end all the conflict and the bloodshed caused by the war. So settlement of disputes now has to be done peacefully according to a treaty. So a treaty helps in the establishment and achievement of peace, and that's why we often hear the word peace attached to a treaty. But the thing is, when the two sides are coming to an agreement, it's usually always one side who has to compromise, or one side who has to agree to get the shorter end of the stick, and that side happens to be the defeated parties. So therefore a treaty is an agreement between the two sides who are fighting a war to sit down, come to a negotiation, settle all disputes peacefully, and finally end the conflict that's going on. So after the First World War, the negotiations that took place were mostly amongst the four powers who won the war. And these four powers are often referred to as the Big Four powers. So which were the Big Four powers? You have Britain, you have France, you have the United States of America, and you also have Italy. And in this picture you see the leaders of these Big Four powers are sitting together to negotiate the terms and to negotiate the situation of the world after the First World War. So over here you see Lloyd George, who is the Prime Minister of the Great Britain. Then you have Vittorio Emanuele Orlando, who was the Prime Minister of Italy. Then you have Georges Clemenceau. Now, Georges Clemenceau was the Prime Minister of France. And finally you have Woodrow Wilson sitting on the extreme right, who was the President of the United States of America. Now two things must have occurred to you while we were looking at the powers who negotiated the terms of the peace after the war. First, Russia has not made its appearance in the negotiation. This is because, if you remember, Russia happened to have exited from the war in the year 1917, before the war came to an end. The second being that Italy, which initially was a Triple Alliance power, if you remember, had left the Triple Alliance and joined hands with the Triple Entente powers, which made it a victorious power at the end of the First World War, and therefore it was included in the negotiations of the peace after the war. Now the negotiations took place in Paris, and therefore this negotiation was known as the Paris Peace Conference. And in this peace conference, as a result and outcome of the Paris Peace Conference, we see the Treaty of Versailles is being created as the peace treaty at the end of the First World War. Now another thing which you must notice is Germany has not been made a part of the negotiations which led to a Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was a treaty which was particularly
Targeted.
towards Germany, but Germany itself was not allowed because Germany was the country which lost the war. Now, moving on, let's see what the Treaty of Versailles was all about. Before we move ahead, can you answer this question? The Treaty of Versailles was the outcome of which conference? Was it the Berlin Peace Conference? Was it the Paris Peace Conference? Was it the Conference of Parties? Or was it the Hague Convention? The correct answer happens to be the Paris Peace Conference. Now, as I just mentioned, Germany was not a part of the negotiations and also was not allowed to attend the conference in the first place. And how did exactly the Allied powers get Germany to sign the treaty? Well, you see, the German representatives were called in. They were put in a separate room right next to the conference room. While the Allied nations or the big four powers decided, debated, and negotiated all the terms of the treaty, at the end of it, when the outcome document was ready, these representatives were called and then they were made to sign the treaty, after which they were again asked to leave. So, as you can see, the fate of Germany was
In the hands of the big four powers.
and Germany itself was not allowed to even speak up or even be a part of the negotiations about its own future. Thus, the Treaty of Versailles was signed on 28th of June 1919 in the beautiful and magnificent Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, which you see right over here. And this particular Palace of Versailles happens to be in France. Now, this was between the victorious allies, namely the big four nations, Britain, France, Italy, and of course the United States of America, and defeated Germany, which, by the way, who was not allowed to attend the conference, was only called to merely sign the treaty. Now, two things are very symbolical about this. First, the place itself. The Hall of Mirrors was where Germany made France sign the treaty after the Franco-Prussian War and in the war which France lost. So France wanted this treaty to be signed over here as a sense of revenge, and finally they are making Germany bow down to their terms. And secondly, the date itself. Does anything strike to you about this date? Well, 28 June, if you remember, was the very same day when the Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo exactly 5 years back. So, the Treaty of Versailles just ended the war exactly 5 years after it started. Thus, the war officially ended between the Central and the Allied powers after the agreement was done at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And you see the very front page of the Treaty of Versailles,
Which was the title?
a treaty of peace. Now, this particular treaty, while it was called the Treaty of Peace by the Allied powers at least, had a different reception in Germany itself. Well, you see, in Germany, this treaty was called a diktat. Now, why exactly was this treaty called a diktat? Well, let's first understand what the word diktat means. Well, you see, the word diktat in the language German means an imposition or any order or decree which is imposed by someone who happens to be in power or a higher power above you, and this particular decree or order is passed without popular consent,
Or it does not take public opinion into account.
so this particular treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, was called a diktat by the German public. Let us see exactly why this is the case. Well, you see, this treaty was forced on Germany with no freedom of choice. This is because Germany only had two choices while having to sign the treaty: either to sign it and accept all the terms, or to not sign it and have the Allies declare war upon it again. Now, Germany had lost its empire by this point of time. Its army had disintegrated. Germany was running low on supplies and resources, and it simply could not afford to prolong the war. Therefore, the choice of not signing the treaty and therefore having the war being brought upon it again simply did not exist. That is why, even though Germany did not want to sign the treaty, it had to. But do you think this disappointment just disappeared? It did not. And this disappointment regarding the imposition of the treaty remained with the Germans and will soon find a different outlet, which we'll see in the upcoming chapters. Germany also happened to feel humiliated at the fact that they were not even allowed to attend the Paris Peace Conference. Since the treaty was mostly aimed and targeted towards Germany, they felt that they at least deserved to be there to negotiate their future. The fact that they were simply called over there to sign the treaty and nothing else made them feel humiliated. There was another reason why the treaty was considered to be a diktat as well, and it was the role the various allied nations played in drafting the treaty. Well, you see, the US President Wilson, he wished to have a balanced path, and he wanted to enforce the 14 points to settle all disputes peacefully. On the other hand, we see the European powers, the European allies, namely Britain and mostly France, who wanted to put all the blame on Germany for the war and thus punish them harshly. While Britain wanted to punish Germany only financially, France had a more personal stake in the game. As you can already understand, with the very location where the treaty was signed, France took the entire ordeal pretty personally. France wanted to exact revenge from Germany, as France was the country which lost the most in the First World War. And that is why we see that even though the US president is willing to take a more peaceful path, the European powers or the European allies want to frame Germany the perpetrator of war. And finally, we see in the treaty itself, Germany was declared responsible for the war. Not only the damages or the destruction or any other thing done during the war, Germany was also given the blame of the war or the fact that Germany happened to start the war. Now, we have had a pretty detailed discussion on the various causes of war. To what extent do you feel Germany was to be held responsible for starting the war? Now, you see, because Germany was made responsible for the war, all kinds of destructive terms were imposed upon Germany
In the name of war reparations,
or the price Germany has to pay for its actions. And these terms were again especially drafted by whom? The allies like France, who we already saw had a very personal stake in the game and wanted to get revenge from Germany. So when the allies had to let France make the terms, France made sure that Germany can never resurface again as a powerful nation.
so these particular terms were purposely made unfavorable for the Germans.
Not just to get a leverage on Germans, but some of them were actually increasingly unfair
And in some cases inhumane as well.
And finally, like I mentioned, Germany was given a choice, but do you think this choice is really one that matters, as it was either to accept the terms or it was to be invaded by the allies? Germany, having no option, had to sign the treaty, but the German public could never accept the
Humiliating.
terms put upon them, and soon this will lead to another world war, as the dissatisfaction in the hearts of the Germans would never go down. Now, this picture is a satirical depiction of the terms or the unfair terms imposed upon the Germans,
For which the Germans called this particular treaty a diktat.
So you see over here that the Germans are being given this particular treaty that Either you have to pay for all damages to all civilians on land or sea or from the air. So whatever happened during the war, no matter which side or which power was causing that damage,
Germany was to be held responsible for all of it.
and this particular term was given in the form of a paper which shows that it's a treaty. But if you see, it's a sword that's holding this paper, which says that even though it's a peace treaty, the repercussions of not accepting this particular treaty will eventually end up in war. Now, in this particular video, we saw the peace achieved with Germany after the First World War, namely in the form of the Treaty of Versailles. We saw the Treaty of Versailles, who drafted it, who were the ones who were present during the negotiations, and we also looked into the nature of the treaty and also tried to understand why the German public consider it to be an imposition or a diktat. In the next video, we will look at the various terms we have just mentioned to be increasingly unequal and unfair, and then we will try to understand whether those terms were fair in the first place or not, and what repercussions would those particular terms have for the future of the world, especially after the First World War.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.